Awesome. Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome back to my webinar series, Ditching Diet Culture. For those of you returning for week 2, welcome back. Thank you again for joining. And for those of you joining for the first time, thanks for coming. I'm really excited to be doing this second episode. And so I just want to thank you for being here. So before we get started, first order of business, I don't know if you saw my chat, but in this episode, we will be doing a mindful eating activity. And so I have a pretzel here, just a single pretzel. You can get whatever you want, chocolate chip, an apple, something like that. Just something that you can take a bite out of or something that's small that you can fit into your mouth at once. So if you want to grab something for the activity later in the episode, I'll give you a minute or two. If not, you're still more than welcome to follow along, but it'll just be fun if you want to join along. And then also just a couple quick housekeeping things. If you have signed up for the series, you are registered for all the episodes. So if you signed up for episode 1, you're scheduled out through episode 4. If you signed up for today's episode, again, you'll be signed up through the end, so you don't have to keep re-signing up. I also want to mention that this episode will be recorded just like last week's, and I will make that available to anybody who would like it at the end. I'll also be putting it up on YouTube and posting it up on my social media as well. And last, just like my last week's presentation, this will be about a 30-minute presentation, and then at the end, I'll give some time for Q&A, discussion, any thoughts that you want to share with me. So if you want to hold your questions to the end, think if anything comes up throughout the presentation. So yeah, with that being said, I'm going to head and get started with the second episode. So today's episode is titled Why Food Freedom is Greater Than Diets. Okay, so let's get to it. My webinar objectives for this episode are as follows. I would like to explain the idea of food freedom and why this technique is used in practicing a different way of eating and shifting that mindset. I'd like to also review the takeaways and discussion we had in episode 1 in case you missed my first episode. I would like to differentiate between intuitive and mindful eating, and we'll practice, like I said, a mindful eating technique together. I'd also like to demonstrate how food freedom creates a more positive and flexible mindset in comparison to dieting. And last, I would like to explain how this contributes to the longevity of health habits in the long run. So again, if you're joining for the first time this week or haven't seen the recording of episode 1, I'll just briefly catch you up. Last week, we discussed the damaging nature of diets. The diet industry is this multi-billion-dollar monster that caters directly to the challenges that come up when people are trying to make lifestyle change. You'll hear those red flag phrases like quick and easy or melting the fat away, melting the weight away, because quick results are what people are looking for, and so they'll cater directly to that. But we talked a little bit about why this quick and easy method is a little bit more damaging than helpful. Falling into a yo-yo diet cycle can really create a higher threshold of fat loss each time you go around the circle. It can create irregulation in metabolic and hormonal regulation, and inherently can induce some really negative and unhealthy mindsets, namely restriction, guilt, and rigidity. Ultimately, these side effects of dieting are detrimental to the longevity and sustainability of our health habits. So to that, I offer an alternative, and that is food freedom. It is a very simple idea, though not as simple in practice. And that's ultimately why I'm hosting this webinar. I'd like to kind of pave way for this to be an easier path. And so in theory, with food freedom, the idea is that there's no food that's not allowed. And just side note here, I'm not including any sensitivities or allergies. You know, if you are celiac, gluten-free, I'm not suggesting that you should have gluten, but just in general, food should be a freedom. There's no good or bad food. There's really just, you can eat whatever you want. And to that, you're probably thinking, oh my God, this person's crazy. If she thinks that I can allow myself to eat whatever I want and still achieve my health goals, then she's crazy. And maybe I am, but just hear me out. Usually within diet culture, rules are centered around what food you eat, how often you eat, and how much you should eat. And this all links back to that rigidity that I suggested in last week's episode. With food freedom, there are 2 rules that you must stick to in order to be successful. First, you need to be willing to follow a generally healthy diet pattern. And when I say generally, I mean generally. Not all day, every day do you have to be following a strict and rigid diet that, you can't have unhealthy or sweet or fast foods, but just generally. As in, if you looked back on the 60 years of eating this way, your average would reflect this healthy pattern, just an average. So I like to think, when I say like a generally healthy diet, I like to think of like the Mediterranean diet. I don't typically recommend a specific diet, but I think this Mediterranean framework is really just kind of generally reflects what you think of as a healthy diet. So I'm talking lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, lean protein, healthy fats like nuts and fish, and olive oil, and then some moderate alcohol consumption. When I say generally healthy diet pattern, I do not mean ditch all the foods that don't fall into this Mediterranean pattern. It just means that this is a good foundation to build off of, and that should kind of be the general adherence to that pattern. And then the second rule is your mindset. This one is a little bit more difficult, but essential to practice if this is a path you're going to go down. You need to be able to exercise mindfulness, self-reflection, and accountability. And I'll go into why this is so important for the successful implementation of this food freedom principle. So food freedom means eating whatever you want, sure. But it also implies an eventuality of balance and self-regulation. As in, over time with education and practice, you'll be able to better control, better self-regulate your response to feelings of hunger and of fullness. You will feel content eating this healthy diet that you've created for yourself. You will know that with that healthy diet comes room and flexibility to eat those like less healthier options and not feel that associated guilt. You'll feel less inclination to binge. You'll feel the ability to maintain this pattern over time. That sustainability piece that I keep mentioning is so important. As I've said before, this is all a practice. And with practice, I'm suggesting that you can ditch that yo-yo cycle, that up and down. So within this food freedom ideology, there are 2 really commonly referenced practices. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of these, or maybe you've heard of one or not the other, but they're intuitive eating and mindful eating. They're often used very interchangeably, but in practice, they're not quite the same. So intuitive eating essentially is a framework. It's the framework that I've been suggesting throughout this entire Ditching Diet Culture series. And essentially it's the base of my nutrition philosophy. It's tapping into your intuition. It's eating because you're feeling hungry and stopping because you're full. It's exercising because it makes you feel good and removing restriction because it's not quite a natural feeling. It's doing the things that make you feel good and feel most natural, and not having to really struggle and fight against the things that you may have thought previously were necessary for a healthy lifestyle. Now, on the other hand, we have mindful eating. And mindful eating is more of a dedicated tactic to practicing this tapping in, this framework that we're trying to set our foundation of. So it's basically engagement of your mind while you're eating or making food choices or serving yourself food. And there are a lot of techniques that people use to practice this mindset of mindful eating. And so now I'm going to go into a couple different strategies, because mindful eating, it can be a little tricky. And so there are some ways to kind of keep you centered down and tuned in when using this technique. So first, and one of the most important things I think in mindful eating is going to be eliminating distraction. So this is really important, especially too, as we're working from home as often as we are now, where there are distractions around us constantly. I mean, I'm always near my phone. I'm always near my computer. You know, I don't have a work environment, which really centers me and keeps me away from those distractions. So distractions are everywhere these days. Most people I know, including myself, like I just said, have those distractions around us while we work too, and while we're eating. And when we're distracted when we're eating, that can create some basically some environments in which kind of go against this mindful eating technique. So staring at your phone while you're eating, working while you're eating, watching TV, that's kind of what I'm talking about here. So when you're focused on something other than the food that you're eating, it's much easier to eat too quickly, essentially, which doesn't give your body enough time to regulate its feeling of hunger and also fullness, more importantly. Essentially, when you eat too fast, let's say you serve yourself a full plate of food and you eat that food in 5 minutes. But it takes your hunger hormones or your fullness hormones 20 minutes to kick in. That means if you would have taken 20 minutes to eat that food, you may have realized that you didn't need the whole meal. You felt full before the end of the plate came. Whereas if you finished it in 5 minutes and didn't give your body enough time to catch up, you may have eaten a little bit more. And that's when you get that really overly full, kind of like bloated feeling. So essentially, these hormones that create this fullness feeling need some time to respond to the stimulus of the food entering your stomach. And so even though you don't feel full yet, you might have already eaten a little bit too much, like I just said. Which leads me into our next tip. How do we slow down? Well, 1, we remove distractions. And 2, we can practice some more specific, some more targeted techniques. So a couple of these have been helpful for other clients of mine. Personally, I use C. But yes, eating with chopsticks, it sounds kind of funny, but how many of us do that so oftenly that we're proficient enough to not have to really slow down to make it a useful way of eating? So eating with chopsticks is a kind of a fun one that people like to help themselves slow down while eating. B is a little less desirable for some people. I don't like this one as much, but some people like this one. Chewing your bite so many times before swallowing. That also really helps slow down eating. This one's my favorite, is putting your utensil down in between bites. It actually breaks up each bite you take. And I find it's the most effective at slowing that eating process down, for me at least. But that's a good one as well. So these techniques can be used to slow the eating down. And then those two can really lead into my last tip, which is when you're not distracted, when you're slowing down, you can start to think a little bit more. And you can ask yourself questions about the eating process, why you're eating, how you're feeling when you're eating. So these are some questions that you can ask yourself that you can really tune into and tap into. You know, why am I eating this food? Is it because it's just supporting my day-to-day function and I need energy for it? Or is it because it's your favorite food and you just really want to eat it? Or maybe you're at a family gathering and it's the only food available. Maybe you're bored or stressed or feeling a certain way, and that's why you're eating. And like, what feelings does it make you feel? Does it make you feel happy? Does it make you feel guilty? Does it make you, does it fill some sort of hole if you're emotional eating? I know that happens to me sometimes. So sometimes food can serve different purposes than just satisfying hunger, and those are all really valid reasons. But the key is understanding and tuning into the why, because it really does kind of lead back into that self-regulation piece. And then those 2 questions at the end, am I hungry and am I full? Those are 2 really huge ones too that I don't think we pay attention to enough. Okay, so I've kind of explained mindful eating as like trying to be present in the moment, slowing down, thinking about why you're eating and when to stop. It's challenging. It's a challenging thing to do, especially if you've never done it before. But I'm going to give us now a little time for a practical application of this. And so that's why I asked you guys to grab some sort of food or some sort of snack at the very beginning of this presentation. So I have a little pretzel here, and I'm going to do this with you. I'll try to, at least I don't want to talk with food in my mouth, but I'm going to kind of guide you through this next activity. So we're going to start by paying attention to the item using our senses. So put it in the palm of your hand, and I just want you to take a look at it. Does it take up all of your hand? Does it take up a little part of your hand? What does it look like in the palm of your hand? What about its color? What about the shape? Is it heavy or is it light? Does it melt in your hand? Does it crumble? Start to pay attention just using your sight. What does it look like? How does it feel? Tactical sense. Take a minute, just kind of think about it. It's kind of a silly activity, but just go with it. Okay, so now you're gonna bring it to your nose and you're gonna smell it. So how does it smell? Does it smell sweet or savory? Does it smell bitter? Were you able to smell it even before you brought it close to your face? So this pretzel, it definitely smells great, but I couldn't smell it before. But maybe if you were eating something a little bit more fragrant, you may have smelled it a little bit before that. When you smelled it, did you get hungrier after you smelled it? Or maybe no change at all? Just starting to pay attention to our sense of smell. Okay, so now we're gonna go for a taste. And I'm going to say, take a bite of it if it's a bigger piece. So I'm gonna take a little bite of this pretzel. Or if it's a chocolate chip, something small, you can just pop it into your mouth, but don't chew it just yet. So take a bite and just taste it. Let it sit on your tongue. You can kind of feel the shape with your tongue. If it's meltable, let it melt. Think about what it tastes like. For me, I'm getting a lot of saltiness. So I know it's a small piece, but now what we're gonna do is we're gonna just take a little bit of a bite, just a little one. Does it crunch? How much does the texture change? Do you enjoy that texture change? Or now that it's been sitting in your mouth for a second, is it kind of soggy? Did you enjoy the texture? Did you not enjoy the texture? Having one bite, does that now make you hungrier? Okay, so now you can finally swallow. So think about that entire experience with that food. How do you feel about the food now? Are you thinking harder about the experience that you had? Just notice like where your mind went to when you were doing the activity. Were you able to stay present and stay focused and really pay attention to that really small item through the entirety of the exercise? Or did you find your mind straying from something else? Do you feel hungry now? Do you wish you had more? These are all questions and that you can ask yourself when you're eating. And this is kind of a silly activity, kind of a silly experience, but it's a really slow breakdown of all the tools that you have available to you to mindful eat when you first get out. And so it's that really simple breakdown. What does it taste like? How does it feel? What emotions are being elicited? That can really kind of, don't have to be present with every single bite you take on every single meal you eat. But overall, when you start to really pay attention to the reasons why you eat, can just be a good, a good practicing moment over time. And why am I saying to practice these mindsets at all? How is thinking more intuitively or more mindfully going to make any sort of lifestyle change for you? How does food freedom or eating, what you want create results? It's based on a couple different things. So the first thing that this is based on, and probably the most important thing that this is based on, is a principle called habituation effect. Essentially, habituation effect explains that as you are repeatedly exposed to something, a stimulus, such as a particular food, your response to that stimulus decreases over time. So for example, if you have pizza on the table every night, eventually, every night you eat it, it's going to become less appealing as you continue to have that stimulus there in front of you. A common practice that I hear people suggest for making big change is to just not keep bad foods in the house, not keep the chocolate, not keep the pizza or the cookie dough. And I think that can be part of the problem sometimes. Going back to that restrictiveness we talked about in episode 1, this practice can really cause that rubber band effect. When you remove it entirely, the more you think about it, the more you want it. And it can cause some serious guilt when you do finally reintroduce it back in. Well, now that it's in the house, I'm just going to eat it all the time, and that's not good. So there's some negative side effects to completely removing it. So I suggest you keep them around. Use this habituation effect principle. And while at first you might overeat or, binge on these bad foods, once you stop, the other piece too is stopping labeling them as good or bad. They are just food, and they are probably what you could say are moderation foods. Keep them at hand. Stop putting so much attention, so much focus on them, and they become less desirable. They have less power. And if you don't believe me, let's think about it from a little bit different of a perspective. So this is not my metaphor, but I really love this metaphor. I think it's a great one. And it's basically, think about habituation effect is like saying I love you for the first time. The first time you say I love you, it's this incredible feeling. It feels so good. It just warms your chest. You might get just that whole body glow. And you just want to say it all the time. You want to say, I love you, I love you, I love you. You're in that honeymoon phase and you just can't get enough of it. But eventually, as you get used to life with that person, as you get used to their love and they get used to yours, it starts to change a little bit. I love you still has the same meaning always, but it doesn't quite have the same glow that it used to. You still say it because you want to, but you don't have to. You don't feel that insatiable feeling. So when you embrace food freedom, that same pattern can be established through those unhealthy foods that we all fear eating so much. So these are some of the responses that I get to suggesting this principle, and they're all totally valid, and I understand the skepticism behind implementing this lifestyle. It seems unachievable to some. And like I said, these are all totally valid. Going back to something I said in my last episode though, lifestyle change is not easy in a conventional sense. It takes some practice to shift your mindset, but if you're committed to saying goodbye to dieting and restriction, I promise you, this is the first step. You might think that if it's there in front of you, you're going to have it all the time. You might think that mindful eating is a pain at first because it does take a little bit of extra practice and extra thought. And you might be frustrated with the slowness of this process. Some people want quicker results, and that's totally valid. But ultimately, these principles do add up to something bigger over time. So just like everything else I've suggested, this takes practice. And, it's not all going to happen at first. But I would like to just kind of clue into something that I talked about last week. So this is a slide that I included in my presentation from last week. And I want to compare it against this new mindset that I'm suggesting. So I propose that with diet culture, restriction, guilt, and rigidity are encouraged or associated. Some of the principles of dieting and restrictive diets can really be inherently causing some negative emotions, whether or not you're prepared for it or whether or not you fight against it. They just have some of those little things that kind of add up over time. Now, in comparison, imagine if you replaced restriction, guilt, and rigidity with flexibility, some forgiveness, and sustainability. What would happen to that like 60-year health average that I talked about earlier? With let's say with the diet culture average. Think about it like a graph, and then this is over time. You have those high spikes, you have those high up and downs. You have weight gain spiking up and down over time. You have motivation spiking up and down over time. You have frustration, negativity, these mindsets that just come up as you practice this over time. And they go up and down, high. It's kind of hard to really stay on one level for a long time just because of the nature of diet culture and dieting. Now, on the other hand, imagine, the same graph over time, but something much smoother, a nice wave. You still have those up and downs, but they're much less aggressive. You have those days where you eat less healthfully, and you have those days where you're feeling really frustrated. And then on the contrary, you have days where you're eating clean and pristine, but then you have those, those kind of fluctuations. Ultimately, that even line results in a much more beneficial average compared to the up and down spikes. It's going to improve that average over time. It's hard to think about the long game, but I propose that this mindset really creates a healthier relationship with food and a more sustained approach to making lifestyle change. So, if you've ever felt frustrated by diet, exercise, health, these changes that you've made in the past, I really want you to stop for a second and think about how that made you feel. Really, really feel it. The best of times and the worst of times, the frustration and the achievements. Now think about them together, separate and together. I think they're both valid. I can't speak for you all, but I can imagine that battling those up and downs can be frustrating. And imagine battling that for the rest of your life. I'm going to assume it's something that doesn't want to be present forever. Though it's a more long-term practice, I'm suggesting that there's a strategy to removing these negative feelings and overall improving relationship with yourself and the food that you eat. I want to encourage everyone to detach from the culture that foods are black and white. They're good and they're bad. It really amplifies these negative disordered eating behaviors and can skew the average that I was talking about earlier. It forces those sharp spikes up and down when we think of foods as either good or bad and don't see the benefit of them in different lights. And then making the diet a diet of balance and moderation. It really can affect the way that our health outcomes kind of come out over time. It affects our feelings, it affects our insecurities. So I just want you to think about that and how that makes you feel over time. So it's not easy to remove this mindset. I'm still personally working to remove these mindsets and these bad habits after years after I've stopped dieting. I ditched it a while ago because it was really negative for me. But I still have these little things that come up over time, these little habits that I'm still working to remove that diet culture really instilled in me. So like I said, it's been years for me and I'm still practicing it. But ultimately, practice has changed my life. And so next week, I would really like to go into more some strategies as to how we can implement this ideology, this food freedom piece, and how we can do it effectively, and how we can still achieve the health outcomes that we're wanting to achieve. I'll keep talking about this shifting mindset, and I'll give you the how. So I've gone through, again, a lot of information. Today's episode was a little bit more self-reflective and thoughtful. And it's just, again, the surface level of what this all can entail. And I'd really like to, again, go into these strategies of how we can shift the mindset, because I've talked a lot about shifting the mindset, but how do we do that? How do we start? But that concludes today's episode, and I would really, really love to hear if you guys have something to say, if you have some feedback or questions. I would love to hear them now. So I'm going to unmute everyone, and if you do have any thoughts or questions, please feel free to ask. You can either just go ahead and speak out, or you can share in the chat function as well. I'm going to unmute everyone. Just give me one moment. Okay.
Well, I'll go first.
Yes, please.
Tonight was great.
Thank you.
Lots of food for thought. Take that 2 ways, right?
Yeah, right.
I actually made dinner tonight. My daughter at the last minute came over for dinner, and I cooked something really healthy, She ate very far away from me because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And I was watching her, and I realized she was so happy to have a prepared healthy meal
Mm-hmm.
so fast and not being mindful. And we talked about it. I mean, I think I even said, why don't you put your fork down? So
You know,
I,
I talked a lot about distraction, but it's not always distraction that causes us to eat fast, you know?
right.
Sometimes it's
She
just the way we
actually,
were raised. We eat fast. Or sometimes it's the food is so good, I can't get enough. I'm eating fast. It's a lot of reasons.
yeah. And then I ate, and I was very happy, very satisfied. And there was like a little bit left of what it was. Again, it was all very healthy. So I put what was left on my plate and I ate it. And now I am so unbelievably stuffed, from it. And I could have stopped. So it's that I need to be more mindful with it and realize I was so satisfied when I got done. I did not need more,
Hmm.
even if it was healthy.
Yeah, it's interesting too because, I always like to say that it happens to me often. I eat too much and I get that full feeling. And I like to reframe it from, it's not necessarily that you should have stopped eating or that you needed to stop eating. Sometimes you just overeat and that happens and that's okay. But ultimately it's like you start to like pay attention to it. And then it's not necessarily like, oh, that was a good or a bad thing. It just, it is what it is. And you start to it becomes more of a practice where you think, okay, I think I'm done now, and that's it. I like to remove the guilt piece around it because I don't think it's necessarily always a controllable thing too. Sometimes it just happens, but yeah, it's interesting. I think too, like I used to you finish your plate, whether or not it was the way you were raised or whatever, but something that I have a hard time doing as well. And so when I slow down, I notice that I'm more effective at kind of stopping when I do feel full.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But thank you for sharing.
Sure.
Well, I just want to say that I thought that this was an awesome presentation. One, I feel like I used to practice it back in my early 20s. I had all kinds of different health things, and um, it eventually kind of full circle came back to taking a focus on nutrition. And I started practicing mindful eating just to even see if I could sense like certain things in my diet that could be affecting my immune response.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really helpful for a long time. And now it's kind of funny because I work for an integrative health clinic, but so many people that I work with, they have a very restrictive diet. So you hear a lot about, avoid the carbs, and every sugar is, it feels like, at least from my perspective, that sugar is evil. And I feel like I've kind of revolted against it. And so I've done actually less mindful eating since working in this industry because that diet culture I just don't agree with it. So I kind of need to go full circle and find that middle ground again.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure too that it's, a stark contrast when you have a lot of people who, and like eating differently than other people too. It's, you have different mindsets, and when you're eating together,
Yeah,
can be challenging too to like detach and still kind of center into your own feeling.
for sure. And I do like to sport eat. That's what I call it, because I just like food. um, so I feel like balancing out the sport eating with a little more of the mindful eating, just because I do feel like that restrictive mindset doesn't like bode well for me. I
Mm-hmm.
get kind of, just like you say, you tend to yo-yo more. You start feeling like guilty, like you did something bad or something wrong for eating a food that you just enjoy, just because.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
All right. there's not anything else, I'll wrap up for the evening. I would really just like to thank everybody for joining me again. This is episode 2. I'm excited for episode 3. If you have any feedback for me, if you would like me to send up any follow-up information, I'm going to send up just kind of a follow-up email after today. And I look forward to seeing you all next week, hopefully.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
She's so cute. Oh my God.